Hi, with this video, I'm going to wrap up my scary videos for this month of October. However, next year I will bring out more scary related material that you could use in your tabletop role-playing games. So in this video, I'm going to focus on something that could be considered either an artifact or an item in tabletop role-playing games that could be a great source of power, but also with significant risks when you are using that item or artifact. And this artifact is the Grimoire. The Grimoire is a very powerful book of spells, formulae, and occult lore. In tabletop role playing games, I've seen it usually handled in two ways. One, a very light-hearted sort of way, where there is little repercussion to using that book. It's usually in those tabletop role playing games that try to emulate a JRPG or Japanese role playing game type of experience. So you have these books that contain all sorts of instructions to cast usually elemental based spells. So you have things such as Thunderbolt and Flame Sword and all sorts of stuff that you would see perhaps in anime or manga. And those grimoires are not scary at all. The main characters can use those books constantly, and there are no negative effects almost all of the time. And when there is actually some sort of negative thing about that grimoire, like for example, maybe it houses some sort of demon or strange entity or deity, it the entity is released, and perhaps the main character suffers a bit because, oh no, what have I brought to this fantasy world of sorts, or what are the repercussions. But later on, the main character usually fights against that entity, and the entity becomes either a servant or fuses with the main character, or becomes a source of power for the character. So when there is some sort of backlash or repercussion to using that grimoire, the impact is not significant, and it's not scary at all. It's usually more dramatic, and it features some sort of action-packed, over-the-top combat scene. So grimoires in used in that style, they are not useful for scary role-playing games. So we're going to put those aside. Now let's talk about grimoires that could be terrifying, disturbing in horror role-playing games. I think the best examples to create such grimoires are those grimoires that supposedly contain real power in real life, that were usually written supposedly in medieval times and the Renaissance. So those books are usually very disturbing, contain all sorts of very dangerous instructions, and those are perhaps what have been used constantly as examples in all sorts of works of fiction. And when it comes to fiction, perhaps the most famous grimoire would be the Necronomicon, of course, created by H.P. Lovecraft. We're not going to go into a deep study of how the Necronomicon is related to perhaps the different Arabian works and the influences, what served as inspiration for Lovecraft to create this, perhaps one of the most famous works of horror fiction, or rather horror within the horror fiction, sorry. So the Necronomicon has been used in many different places: comic books, movies, video games, and it can be used as a sort of example as to how to create a scary grimoire. First, if we look at the book in a physical sense, in its physical composition, the original Necronomicon, and it depends on the media where it appears, in comic books and movies, but it is usually represented as a book bound in human flesh and inked in blood. So right then and there, we have a lot of lore and background story to it, because who was the person used to create that book, that is the owner of that human skin, to bind that book? And was the blood of that same person, or from another person, or from another being entirely, from an animal, from some sort of alien or strange creature? So we can use those elements as examples to create our own grimoires in tabletop role playing games that at the same time will disturb the players. Maybe there is a book that is made entirely out of pieces of bone, perhaps a sort of scroll made out of ribs, and each bone has glyphs and runes engraved on them or even painted on them. And so you kind of like unfold this grimoire of bones, and you start to try to decipher what is written or carved in those bones. Perhaps there are more unconventional shapes to a grimoire. Maybe there is some sort of ogre or giant skull that has all of the spells and occult lore engraved or painted on it. And some grimoires perhaps are very impractical, to transport or move around. Maybe a grimoire is composed on huge stone tablets or metal plaques. There are so many ways in which you can play around with the physical components of a grimoire. So you should try to make those ingredients or those parts of the grimoire to be as disturbing as possible if you really want a strong impact on the player characters. Maybe there is a book of dwarven lore, or perhaps the rare dwarf spells. In most fantasy settings, dwarves are not particularly skillful or knowledgeable spellcasters. So maybe this sort of grimoire has been made of dwarven teeth. Maybe you have this a bunch of dwarf teeth fused together or bound together in some way, and it makes the cover or the entirety of the grimoire. So you can have all sorts of disturbing imagery. You can play around with those physical elements that build the book. Now, perhaps the scariest thing about grimoires are the contents. In contrast with what I mentioned at the beginning of those fantasy grimoires that have little to no impact when you use them, scary grimoires contain lore and spells and all sorts of formulae that supposedly is quite powerful once used, but it always carries some sort of price. Maybe the character catches the attention of some sort of otherworldly entity or being, and now your character is constantly being chased around by that evil or dark entity. In one of the Lamentations of the Flame Princess adventure modules, I'm not going to say which to keep things spoiler free, there is actually an object that if you pick it up, you anger this sort of ancient spirit, and now it's going to follow the character around, and it's quite an invincible entity. So you really have to ask yourself if it was worth it to take that object. And I think grimoires in horror role-playing games should be kind of like that. Even if a player character casts some sort of spell, maybe that spell marks that character for the rest of that character's career and perhaps even beyond. It could be, as I mentioned, an entity, but if you want more mechanical effects, maybe impose some sort of experience points penalty. Maybe for the rest of that character's life, he gains less experience points. That's quite scary from a mechanical point of view. Or maybe you have a penalty on you. That is, maybe you have a -1 or -2 to your attack rolls, and now the player character needs to look for someone who can lift that sort of curse or negative effect. Because grimoires can also be seen as sort of gates or doors or windows to the evil realms beyond. So an entire grimoire could serve to fuel an entire campaign or a few adventures, as the player characters are trying to undo something that they unleashed when they cast some sort of spell. And maybe it was actually necessary to take that risk. What if there is some sort of cataclysm or a very powerful and extremely powerful villain, and that villain seems to be invincible, or that cataclysm seems like it cannot be stopped, and only by using the spells of a grimoire you can do that, but it will get you in trouble with other dimensions and other beings. Because the player character will never know what will be unleashed when he uses the formula in the grimoire. Grimoires could also serve as some sort of prison Maybe you have some sort of a demon or devil or dark god or anything that you can think of. Maybe it's being trapped in this grimoire, and when the character opens the book, it is immediately unleashed upon the campaign setting. So now the player character, the party, needs to find out a way to either destroy that entity or get it back into the book. You can also play around with all sorts of things related to the imagery of the pages of the grimoires. You have all these drawings and illustrations on very disturbing things. Once again, going back to the depiction of the Necronomicon in different media, in comic books, video games, movies, you see all sorts of drawings of winged creatures and skulls with horns, things that look human and inhuman at the same time. So that really serves to unnerve the player characters. Maybe it can hint to further encounters down the line in the campaign or in the adventure. The characters see these monstrous images and they kind of suspect that they will have to face these monstrosities. Grimoires can also be used as some sort of trap. Maybe the book was not useful at all. Maybe the spells contained within actually damn the player character in some way. Maybe they are traps. So maybe there are some grimoires that actually either end up killing the player character when that character uses the spell, or inflicting some sort of disease or poisonous condition. Because if we were to take, for example, grimoires, again from medieval times and Renaissance, there are some books that have this sort of, what would you say, ways to eliminate those that are not very educated or smart, that they tell you something like, oh, you have to rub feces on your wounds or on your eyes, and of course that's dangerous because it's bacteria and it could poison you, it could perhaps leave you blind, or it could kill you. So in fantasy grimoires, in horror role-playing games, you could also create some sort of thing to trick the player characters into actually hindering themselves or harming, perhaps ending their lives, or just applying some sort of negative condition. So that way the player characters are always going to be scary and nervous about using those books. Now I'm going to tell you a story that supposedly happened. It happened on it was reported on December of 1929 into one of those occult newsletters. There aren't too many details, but I think the details are enough for us to build a scenario or an adventure or a campaign around using that story as inspiration. So supposedly there was this man that wrote to this newsletter and telling some very disturbing things about an experience that he had. He supposedly used this very dangerous and famous grimoire that I think part of the thing that caused the calamity in that story and in other stories related to that book is that that book has a terrible translation. It was supposedly written in German, but the translation was so poor that a sort of operation that usually lasted several months was cut in just a few months. That is, let's say it took 18 months to complete it, and in the translation you only need like 6 months. So the operation was imperfect. That's a great element into using your tabletop role-playing games. Maybe the a character that is knowledgeable in some sort of language or translating things could actually be able to use the full potential of the book, but someone who does not know too much about it and trusts some dubious translations of it ends up in great danger. So this man used a sort of talisman to obtain knowledge that he could not obtain in other ways. Who knows what that knowledge was? So he used that, he created the talisman, and he carried out those rituals and the process, and nothing happened, apparently. But it was after that attempt of creating that talisman to obtain knowledge, that man was constantly plagued during the night, and it was the worst parts came during the new moon. He had this restless sleep. He was constantly having nightmares. He started to see strange shapes and shadows in his room. At one time, he started to see the shapes to become a bit more defined and more solid, to put it in a way. He saw this image of a huge looming figure, a bearded figure with flowing hair. But this figure had closed eyes. It seems as if that strange entity was just waking up. I think this is a great way to a great element to use in tabletop role playing games. If one of the player characters has been using this dangerous grimoire, maybe this entity starts to become manifest, or the presence becomes more obvious, and it starts to awaken little by little, becoming increasingly more dangerous, creating all sorts of hunting effects, some penalties and negative things for the party overall. So as the story goes forward, things start to get a bit more violent. There was a time when this man said that there was this huge snake that suddenly appeared in his room, like out of nowhere. And this snake was ready to attack the man, and he was so scared about this huge snake that appeared out of nowhere that the man jumped outside. He basically jumped through his window and fell on rose bushes on his garden. So things became increasingly more disturbing and dangerous according to his side of the story. There was this very bizarre moment when he woke up because he actually saw this obelisk, this red obelisk, crashing through his room, as if someone had taken this obelisk and just threw it against his room, as if a giant had attacked his room using the red obelisk, and it came crashing into his room in a very well, it was quite cataclysmic, to put it in a way, but in a blink of an eye, there was nothing there. So he thought that maybe he had imagined the whole thing, but the next morning, when he was talking to the other people living in his house, they mentioned that they heard some very loud noises, as if some sort of thing crashed into the floor above where his room was at. And so that's a sort of like a puzzle or a mystery. I think this is also a great way to introduce some sort of adventure site. What if some sort of structure suddenly crashed into the inn or the building where the characters are staying at, and maybe they can go inside that object? Or what if it happened somewhat similar to what happened to this man, that this object supposedly crashed into his room and suddenly there was nothing? Maybe it crashed into some sort of other plane or dimension of that room. So now the player characters need to use some sort of spell to go into the etheric or astral plane and figure out what that strange structure is doing there, and who put it there to start with, or how it was summoned there. Maybe it was summoned because of the talisman or of the grimoire or something. Things became even worse later on, to the point that bearded figure that appeared in the room of the man, the hairs of that figure started to become snakes, and the figure opened its eyes, and it has such a devilish gaze, such a disturbing way of looking at the man, that he felt completely helpless. And it was only according to his letter, because he supposedly sent this letter to that cult newsletter. He supposedly asked the help for a friend, from a friend, sorry, that knew more about grimoires and such, and that friend helped that man to get rid of the entire problem. I think it was an occult magazine. So, and that can be used for an adventure or even an entire campaign. How many things could the player characters summon by using that book? And I think the best thing to take from this story when it comes to elements in a horror role-playing game or campaign is that figure that starts to slowly manifest itself, make itself more threatening. First it was like, oh, this is just a bearded man with long hair, and suddenly the beard started to become snakes. Maybe it could be a build-up for a combat encounter in high fantasy games, or in perhaps a Call of Cthulhu sort of situation, those games that are a bit more gritty and realistic within the fiction. Maybe the investigators, the characters have no way of fighting that entity, and as the entity becomes more and more real and more threatening, they need to look for perhaps other books that have a way of dispelling or sending or banishing that entity before it eliminates the entirety of the group of investigators. So regardless of if there is some sort of truth to that story, or if it's completely fictional and perhaps the man was insane, or perhaps there was something else, it serves as a great example, a great thing to use as inspiration in tabletop adventures and campaigns. So grimoires, they are definitely potentially scary artifacts and items that the player characters can use. They're going to be constantly thinking if they should mess with those things. You can really build a solid adventure and a campaign based on that supposedly real story. I think the best part as well is the obelisk. The obelisk and the entity that becomes even more real. They can be used to start a series of events related to that structure. Where did that structure come from? What exactly is that entity? Are there more like it, or is it just one? The snake is also great to threaten the player characters. Maybe you want to create a sort of jump scare, or just remind them that this is a very dangerous thing to be playing around with those books, and suddenly this snake appears and it's actually poisonous, and maybe the player characters try to fight it and it's gone. It just appears for a few combat rounds and then it just disappears. So it's going to be very unnerving, especially because the player characters cannot predict when those things are going to appear. If we remember of the story, that man mentioned that the new moon, make it a bit more likely for those things to manifest. You could also use it in the game calendar. Maybe you're keeping track of the phases of the moon in your tabletop role-playing game. Maybe it is only during the new moon or during the full moon or at certain times when those things manifest themselves. And depending on how useful the grimoire is, maybe the player characters become addicted to using that book to destroy their enemies, to solve all sorts of problems in the campaign. But the backlash, the entities that are coming into the game world become more and more real and more dangerous. So the player characters really have to ask themselves if it's worth it to continue using those grimoires. So yes, it's a truly fascinating subject. There are probably many more ways in which you can use grimoires as inspiration for your adventures and campaigns, but I hope this video was informative enough to get you started in using grimoires in horror role-playing games. Or at least I hope the video was somewhat entertaining. Well, thanks for watching this video, and thank you so much to those of you that have been sending Drive-Thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, I'm going to put the information how to do that in the description of this video. I would like to hear your comments. If you have used grimoires as a sort of horror element in your adventures or campaigns, please let us know in the comment section below. And thank you so much for watching these scary videos for the month of October. My next review is going to feature a very awesome sci-fi role-playing game of a very famous, in fact, series. I want to keep things a surprise. And when I first started to look at that role-playing game, I thought, oh well, this is a good game, but I have seen some things that I would consider brilliant in the representation of that amazing sci-fi saga. Well, thanks again for watching this video. If you have comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.